So guys, today I am able to proudly declare that VR has finally hit its stride. Wait, no, never mind. I mean, today I am sadly declaring that VR gaming is still as irrelevant as ever and solely exists as a niche market. But wait, how is this possible? Is the world of VR growing and just on the precipice of hitting the mainstream, or is this simply a flash in the pan moment for the space as a whole? Welcome to the simulation inside the simulation. I am Tooodamngolden, your VR Voyager, and I figured that now would be the perfect time to take a look at where VR gaming currently stands, hypothesize about where it will be in the next few years, and determine if VR is here to stay or is doomed to be forever relegated as simply a gimmicky platform that lacks staying power.
How many are there?
So for those of you just looking for the short and concise answer to the question of what is the state of VR right now, the simple answer is
legs.
Cautiously optimistic, with the caveat being that another big year of titles is probably needed to keep up the current momentum. But for those of you who want the full picture, the first point I want to make abundantly clear is that this moment in time, right now, is undeniably the absolute best time that VR has experienced in its short but exciting lifespan. And there's not really any arguing that point either, in my opinion, as if you just take a look at the number of quality games that we've gotten our virtual hands on in the last 2 years, then it's easy to see that whether it's via veteran VR studios, small indie teams, or with the support of both AAA IPs and studios, there certainly are a wide array of options for VR enthusiasts to choose from, and we certainly have come a long way from the days where the narrative was, VR has no games. But that's not what I want to talk about here, as I am far more interested in two critical factors when determining where exactly the world of VR stands today: how many headsets are actually out there, and how many users are actually using them. And starting with our first question posed, this truthfully is a difficult one to accurately answer, as Meta, Sony, Valve, and ByteDance aren't exactly rushing to boast about themselves from the rooftop. But what we do have is a series of tidbits of information that, when combined with some good old-fashioned guesstimation, should roughly get us to our answer. So looking at the leaders in the VR industry, Meta, and specifically focusing on the new generation of headsets, i.e. the Quest 3 and 3S, we'll start with the number 1 million, which represents the number of people who have completed the Quest 3 mixed reality introduction experience first encounters. And according to Davin Bigelow, a software developer who has been stalking the First Encounters leaderboards as they show users how many other players have tried the app, this threshold was crossed back in June of this year, indicating that at least 1 million Quest 3s are out in the wild. But of course, as this experience is optional and not at all a prerequisite to getting started with the headset, it doesn't quite tell the full picture. Neither does Mark Zuckerberg's vague yet encouraging statement presented to shareholders back in July, stating that Quest 3 sales are, quote, outpacing our expectations. But one metric that, while admittedly incomplete, does provide a bit more clarity is the most recent Steam hardware survey, which indicates that 1.73% of the 132 million Steam users, or 2,283,600 people, have connected a VR headset in the last month, with 20.08% or 458,547 of these connections being made via a Quest 3, and an additional 23,978 users choosing to link to Steam via the Quest 3S. Now, here's where the guesstimating comes into play, as obviously not every user with a Quest 3 headset will have elected to use it for PC VR, as first and foremost, this is a standalone device. But if we take the 1 million user figure stated earlier and add, let's say, an additional 200,000 people to account for those users who may have bypassed First Encounters, or about 1 in every 5 new Quest 3 owner, gives us an average between its release and June 2024 of 150,000 Quest 3 units being sold monthly for roughly a total of 2.1 million headsets up to date when accounting for the estimated bump in sales for the holiday season, plus of course a margin of error of about 200,000 for our final projection of between 1.9 million and 2.5 million Quest 3 headsets in the market, with another speculated 500 to 750,000 Quest 3S sales occurring since launch and adding more players into the overall VR community in the process. But of course, Meta isn't the only party privy to the VR game, as a recent Reddit post by indie studio Toast Interactive, makers of the highly fun platformer Max Mustard, recently stated that, now we all know that the PSVR 2 hasn't quite received the attention or hardware sales it truly deserves, with approximately 2 million units shipped, 10% that of Quest. Despite being a fraction of the market, Max Mustard has sold better on PSVR 2 during the first 2 weeks of launch than it did on Meta Quest. We thought this was an interesting statistic that breaks the norm of what the industry is seeing. Now, this 2 million unit estimation of course represents a huge jump in sales for the 600,000 units that Sony themselves say they had moved as of May 2023. And when using the same methodology as previously mentioned with the Quest, we are able to roughly ascertain a few key indicators in terms of actual sales with the PSVR 2 and its newly minted PC adapter, seeing about 38,364 users choosing Sony's second VR offering as their preferred PC VR device, or the average of 82,353 units monthly that have been sold between May of 2023 and the purported 2 million headsets sold by October of this year, which based off of sales figures may be a bit high, as the recent 42% discount of the PSVR 2 as a part of the Black Friday festivities have definitely indicated that roughly 24,500 PSVR 2s have been sold through Amazon alone in the last month, and according to Sony reps, this represents a 20x spike in overall sales volume. But using this key vague information alongside our guesstimating abilities, we're able to roughly discern that there are anywhere between 1.8 million and 2.3 million PSVR 2 headsets in the world, and I know there are a ton of other headsets out there, guys, particularly for PC VR players, but for the purposes of this video, I'm just going to focus on Meta and Sony devices, as I feel that these two companies are probably the most well known to a majority of the audience, and B, tracking down sales figures for these two were arduous enough for my taste, so I'm gonna just stop there. But now, on to the second and ultimately more important question posed. How many users are actually using their headsets?
I don't want to play with you anymore.
So via crunching the numbers and some guesswork, we've been able to roughly determine that Meta and Sony, the US's top two VR providers, have sold about 2.5 million and 2 million units respectively, and an additional 1.5 million Valve indexes based off of early market trends and Steam survey results seem to be out there, for a grand total of around 6 million next-gen capable headsets, again, just for purposes of this video. But forget the sales numbers for just a minute, that's not what I want to focus on, and instead I want us to focus on something that I've long called VR's biggest problem, and that of course is that one magical word: retention. Historically, retention has been the bane of the VR market's existence, as developers, publishers, and gamers alike have had to deal with the humbling reality that, yeah, a ton of people have bought one VR headset or another, but what good does that do if they just sit on a shelf somewhere collecting dust? So with all the new advancements in the tech combined with an admittedly much stronger games library, just how much, if any, did the overall rate of retention increase for VR? Well, again, unfortunately for us, this is even more difficult of a number to determine than the overall number of headsets out there in the hands of consumers, but let's start for the reference with two different numbers, the first being 6.37 million, which was the last public release active user count given by Meta at a time where 20 million Quest 2s were already said to be on the market, translating to roughly 31.85% of the Quest 2 owners actually using it daily. But of course we know that Meta does not the entire industry make, and that these figures are significantly higher than the estimated 8 to 12% retention rate that we were able to estimate back in May of last year, especially considering that these aforementioned figures were provided during a bit of a dry spell in the VR world as a whole. So for the purposes of this video, let's use our previously estimated figure of 10%, as this seems to be more in line with what the various industry insiders have reported. Now, with this 10% estimation, let's turn to the recent reports courtesy of Chris Pruitt, Meta's Director of Content Ecosystem, who advised developers at GDC 2024 back in March that, quote, Quest 3 owners return to continuously use apps at a higher rate. But again, per usual, no concrete figures were provided to us, so it's up to us to fill in the gaps, as all we have to go on is an admittedly innocuous enough statement and a few trusty Steam VR survey charts. First up, we have these surveys here from March and April of 2022, thanks to the folks over at Mixed News, and this is a chart from almost a year and a half prior to the release of the Quest 3, and what this gives us is a baseline figure for not only market share, but consistency amongst users of at least PC VR players using various headsets. Roughly 2.5 million users connected to Steam VR in these months, with an average of 47.66% of these being connected via a Quest 2 headset, and this was actually the closest Steam survey that I could recover to around the time of the 6.37 million active users figure that was provided in early October, and this provides us a bit more context around what those figures look like in terms of PC VR connection. But now, let's jump to December 2023, 2 months following the release of the Quest 3 and 1 year before this video is being released, and we can see that Meta's newest headset had already carved out almost 8% of the Steam usage, while the Quest 2 saw a significant fall down to only 37.87% of the marketplace, or a combined 45.87% for Meta headsets, and this of course is to be expected, as uncertainty surrounding PC VR at large was actually contributing to driving down overall headset usage. But finally, to complete this mystery of retention, we need to take a look at one more chart, and I know I am charting you guys to death here, guys, but this is important when trying to make an estimation on where exactly VR retention currently stands. As the November 2024 Steam survey shows us our most current outlook on the medium, and 20.08% of gamers are using a Quest 3 to connect currently, with 34.14% still using a Quest 2, and a tiny but meaningful 1.05% using the brand new Quest 3S, for a total market share for Meta of 55.27% of estimated VR users. Now, this highlights one major thing of note to me, that although the Quest 3 market share has doubled since December of last year, the Quest 2 has only dropped by 3%, and add in the newfound capabilities of the PSVR 2 and the Quest 3S, and these figures in total look all the more promising for VR. But again, sticking with retention, by looking at the figures combined with the comments of developers and insiders, as well as Metas themselves against the trends of the market, I'd be able to confidently say that retention is probably currently sitting somewhere between 12 to 15%, a number that may not seem to be a significant jump from the 10% we were hovering around last year when we did this video. But guys, take any single business entity in the world and tell them that they will be seeing an average of a 10 to 25% jump in active users year over year, and I'm sure they too would be pretty pleased. But now that we have our working figures, 6 million current gen capable headsets, and a retention rate hovering around 12 to 15%, what exactly does this mean for the current state of VR gaming? And this is an excellent question that, when combined with the most important element in the formula, will ultimately give us the answer to said question. And as always, that ever important element is the games. The slate of games released in the last 2 calendar years for VR has been nothing short of amazing. Whether it's sequels from existing veteran VR studios like Asgard's Wrath 2, Vertigo 2, or Into the Radius 2, successful transitions from early access to full launch like Ghost of Tabor and Grimlord, AAA IPs making a debut on a new platform like Assassin's Creed Nexus, Batman Arkham Shadow, Metro Awakening, or Alien Rogue Incursion, or hell, any of these other games on screen now. Not to mention Skydancer's Behemoth. That's 26 good to great games that have reshaped the VR has no games narrative that have released in the last couple of years and have contributed to not only onboarding more new users, but retaining them as well, hence the elevated retention rates. And while this is undoubtedly a mini golden age of sorts for VR, we do have to ask ourselves one critical question: how long can this support last? Because let's be honest guys, as amazing as VR is, it isn't exactly profitable for these companies at the moment, with the latest earning reports from Meta showing a staggering loss of around $4.4 billion for the quarter for its Reality Labs division. And yeah, you heard that right, for the quarter. But even those losses are contrasted by the simultaneous reports of a third consecutive quarter of growth for the division year over year, with quarters 1 through 3 seeing growth of 30, 28, and 29% respectively. And again, this is the duality of the moment. Yes, our ecosystem is growing, but how long can the declared big three of VR, Sony, Meta, and Valve? Yes, Valve, we are still here waiting. Take your time. Continue to pump billions upon billions into R&D for minimal returns. Because as amazing as 29% year-over-year growth sounds, it should be said that we are talking about $270 million in profits against $4.67 billion in costs. These corporations are going to look past the speculative and instead start to look for profits, which fortunately for us could be pushed further into the future simply due to the fact that the main driver of all these companies is a different product or service other than VR. But in terms of game studios taking a chance at jumping into VR, there is very much a calculated risk to be discussed, as we have seen time and time again with gaming in general that one bad release can tank a studio, and in VR with a substantially smaller player base, this is even more so the case. But ultimately again, this moment in time right now is undeniably the absolute best time that VR has experienced in its short but exciting lifespan. With that being said, I think the space is in need of another huge year of releases, particularly from these well-known IPs that are more in line with this recent batch that we received this year, as VR gamers will not and cannot put up with half-baked, non-fleshed out projects. I remain cautiously optimistic about the future and will say that VR is well and alive, but is currently running on an oxygen tank as the real test begins with 2025 and beyond. And as always, all things center around one central thing: the games. Because if I've said it once, I've said it 1,000 times. Gamers love games. Imagine that.